A shout out this week to our guest, Brian Rosenwald. As you'll learn in this episode, Brian wrote a new book about the influence of talk radio on America's media and political landscape. We had scheduled our interview well in advance of this week. 2 days before we were scheduled to record this episode, news broke that conservative talk radio icon Rush Limbaugh was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. That changed things a little in our approach to this episode. No one would consider Brian a conservative, far from it. But his book is about the impact conservative talk radio has had on politics and the media. Brian points out in his book that without Rush Limbaugh, there may not have been the rise of conservative talk radio. His role is that consequential. With that in mind, this episode will not be a biography of the conservative talk host, but we will spend some time on the role Rush Limbaugh has played. If you have any thoughts or feedback, send them to me through email at tim@shapingopinion.com. If it's easier for you, get in touch on Twitter or Instagram at Shaping Opinion. If you want, we can give you a shout out. And as always, thank you for being a listener of the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Brian, in your research for your new book on talk radio, what's the most surprising thing you learned?
The most surprising thing I learned is that this is not driven by politics. That this is a business, and that every day hosts are trying to put on the best show possible, and that the origins of this were not political. Nobody sat down in the room and said, hey, let's create the next big political force in America. It was, very much a happenstance that was discovered by accident, and it was all about making money and building something that would save AM radio.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Brian Rosenwald. He's the co-editor of a daily Washington Post history blog called Made by History, and he's a scholar in residence at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the author of a new book called Talk Radio's America: How an Industry Took Over a Political Party That Took Over the United States. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with Brian about talk radio and its impact on American media and politics. Talk radio didn't begin in the late 1980s. The earliest radio talk shows that had an impact were hosted by broadcasters named Joe Pine, Bob Grant, and Larry King. But the talk radio we know today, the one that has created a sea change in the nation's political dialogue, can trace its roots back to the 1980s, when a number of factors came to a head at about the same time. The 1980s marked a resurgence of the Republican Party in Washington, with a wave of national support that swept Ronald Reagan into the White House. During those same years, the AM radio format started to decline, losing music listeners to the clean and clear signals of FM stations. To carve out a niche and compete with FM, AM radio discovered that talk radio didn't require the same sound quality to attract an audience. Increasingly, AM radio programmed talk and news content on their schedules. In 1987, the FCC's Fairness Doctrine was repealed. The Fairness Doctrine had put restrictive guidelines on how radio stations could air certain speech. With repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, radio stations were free to air news and talk programming that catered to specific audiences with specific points of view, regardless of political leanings. During this time period came the advent of less expensive satellite technology and cell phones. All of this opened the door to innovators who would figure out how to make political speech entertaining enough to attract an audience, and more importantly, to attract advertising revenue to those failing AM radio stations. One innovator in particular would lead the way. In Brian Rosenwald's book, Talk Radio's America, he followed the success of both the format and some of its most high-profile personalities.
This was really an accident that goes back to my graduate school days. I needed one more research class, and it happened to be my last year classes, and all the American historians at the University of Virginia were going on leave at once. And so I went to my advisor and said, I want to write a dissertation on late 20th century America, probably on the demise of moderate Republicans. And what do? You're all going on leave. Your research classes have to feed into that. And he said, you're really writing about polarization. I want you to go out to the law school and take the legal history seminar. And he mentioned the fairness doctrine to me. He said, you're really writing about polarization. And I'm pretty sure that the fairness doctrine goes away. And this guy, Rush Limbaugh, shows up like 2 minutes later. And I said, okay. And I had never heard of the fairness doctrine because I was 4 when it went away. And I started digging into it. And very quickly, I found that it was more complicated than that. It was a much more interesting story. And it was a story no one had told. And I became sort of hooked on the story and on trying to tell it and trying to dig and figure it out. And, how does this thing rise and how does it become so politically important in such a short time period? And that was really the set of questions I was chasing the answers to for 9 years.
Well, Brian, in our opening comments today, we mentioned Rush Limbaugh's recent diagnosis of advanced lung cancer. And we will talk about his role in conservative talk radio. But at the same time, we touched on some of the other major factors that came to play, like you just mentioned, the fairness doctrine. So let's talk about the fairness doctrine for a second. Could you describe what it is?
Fairness doctrine was a regulation that was in place for, I believe it was 38 years. It's always hazy as a historian. You forget, was it this year or was it the next year? But I believe it was 38 years. And it's actually really misunderstood. A lot of people think, because hosts have said for years when people started talking about re-implementing it, hosts say, well, this is a hush-rush bill. They're going to, I'll be gone. You won't have me anymore if this goes into effect. And that's not true. All the fairness doctrine required was overall balance in a station's programming if it was dealing with controversial issues, which means that what you couldn't have today's variety of all conservative station. And market after market after market today, you have a conservative morning show that's usually local, and then you have syndicated conservative talk the rest of the day. And that would have been impossible. But you still could have had Rush Limbaugh. You still could have had Sean Hannity. And the best evidence for this is Limbaugh was doing basically the show that he would become famous with in Sacramento for 3 years under the fairness doctrine. The only difference was there was a liberal host on that station in a different day part, or a different time of day. And so that was what the fairness doctrine mandated. And the Reagan administration gets rid of it with a prompt from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And they get rid of it not because they think, we'll get rid of this and, we'll create a conservative medium or a voice for conservatives. They get rid of it because they believe that regulation is bad. They believe in the free market. And so that's what they're deregulating as an ideological thing, not as hey, let's get a political advantage out of this thing. And it goes away, and many in the radio business credit it for the rise of talk radio, and to some extent admit that stations could program ideological things without worrying about somebody making an FCC complaint. But there were stations that did this before the fairness doctrine went away, and I firmly believe that the talent of Limbaugh would have shined through, and that talk radio would have taken off. It just would not have been all conservative stations.
I remember those days myself, by the way. I happened to be a talk radio producer at one of those big 50,000 watt flamers, we called them, KDK Radio in Pittsburgh. And I was the producer of talk radio in that station. And we actually did. This was the early 80s, so this is while the fairness doctrine was around. And I remember producing 2 shows. One was conservative, the other one was liberal. And the liberal show was on at 6 to 9 p.m., and the conservative show was on from 9 until midnight. That was not because of any kind of bias. It was mainly because the conservative hosts liked working later. But I do remember those days, and I do remember the sort of paranoia within the hallways whenever somebody would do something or say something, and there was always this fear at certain times that you might have to give an opposing view equal time. I do remember that atmosphere, but it wasn't a governing philosophy. It wasn't this constant state of fear within a radio station. It was just one of the factors we had to consider when we produced programming.
Yeah, I mean, people, they had to keep logs. They had to keep more careful records. I'm sure there were people that said, let's just do no controversial, stuff or no political stuff because of it. But, this widespread kind of myth that if the fairness doctrine was re-implemented tomorrow, they'd get rid of all of the conservative hosts is just not true. What you would end up seeing is you'd see what happened in the early days after Rush takes off nationally and as conservative or as talk radio starts to rise, which was you had Rush during the day, but he might be on a station where you had what they called full service talk formats, which was you might have a psychologist doing an advice show or a doctor doing an advice show. And then you had Alan Combs, the liberal host who's unfortunately passed away, but you had Combs on at night, 9 to 12. He was often top rated in his market. You'd have more eclectic things. And to be very honest, those stations were institutions in some markets. KGL in San Francisco was number one in their market for, I believe it was 38 years, with a station that blended lots of different types of talk and opinion. And the reason that radio executives shied away from that kind of station wasn't that it couldn't be successful. It was that it was much more expensive to make it successful. They needed a good news gathering operation. They needed to be a community hub and a community institution. Whereas, once syndication starts to rise, and once you get vertical integration, which means that a lot of these big conglomerates after the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and I don't want to bore your audience too much with the details, but after that legislation that removed caps on how many stations a company could own, you ended up getting these giant conglomerates that owned hundreds of stations, and they also owned syndication arms. And so they were producing shows like the Rush Limbaugh show. And for one set of production costs and talent costs, they could program something that could go on 600 of their stations. And so it just became a better business decision to put on these all conservative formats that were mostly syndicated and that could make them, a lot of money because they had rabid fans who would tune in for really long times, and they could do it with relatively low costs. And again, it comes down to one thing, the bottom line.
Well, it's very interesting that you brought up the 1996 Telecommunications Act because it's almost like a framing of this whenever you look at it, because in 1987 we had the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine that gave birth to what is the talk radio we know today. Then in 1996 under Bill Clinton, there's that other issue. And within that, there were these other factors that happened. You mentioned AM radio, and I mentioned in the opening comments that AM radio was struggling. AM radio doesn't have the signal that FM does, so it was struggling, losing music listeners to that other dial. So what would have happened to AM radio if talk radio had not come along?
AM radio might have died, to be very honest. It was dying. As you mentioned, FM comes along and music sounds better on FM. And with listeners who are going to listen to the innovative music formats on FM that arise in the 60s, as they were flocking to FM, so was the advertising revenue. And AM radio was dying. And a lot of stations take a sort of Hail Mary last shot attempt at saving this in the 80s with a talk format. Even before Limbaugh, you're seeing the rise of talk formats a little bit, which was, more the norm at that point was more like a Larry King kind of show, where you didn't know the political leanings of the host, but they were, asking questions of guests who ranged from mobsters to presidents. And they were, just trying to be interesting and to hook listeners. And these stations are rising because AM needs something unique. And without that unique program, without offering something FM doesn't have, AM might have died. And sort of the irony today is that the Limbaugh, the rise of Limbaugh, the rise of this new type of talk that is very opinionated, that's conservative, that's entertaining, that he pioneered, saves AM radio for a generation, and now AM radio is in trouble again because of the rise of the smartphone and the podcast and people who don't want to listen to 22 minutes an hour of commercials. And so AM radio may yet still die, but it resolved, sort of crisis one, and that was really what happens at that point is that these people are trying this format not because they have an agenda, not because they even think it's going to work. I had a couple of people say to me, "Look, I wasn't sure this was going to work, but I knew that the alternative wasn't going to work, so it was worth taking a shot," and that's what they did.
I think one of the things that I picked up from your book is something that I see in other places as well in the business that I'm in, and that is that the communications landscape is constantly changing, and it changes with every new technology. Every new technology kind of bumps other platforms aside or reshapes them. And there's something that you said in your book that I thought was very telling in that way, because you describe what we might consider now crude technologies, but they did usher in some of that change. You talk about the rise of cable television and VHS movies, like people could rent movies for the first time and not have to wait for a movie to show up on their TV channel. Here's a quote where you quoted Gil Troy in your book, who said, "Talk radio would create an illusion of community and foster a surprisingly strong sense of identity at a time when anonymous shopping malls replaced intimate main streets and political debate was exiled from the interactive town square to the passive TV studio." In other words, basically what you were saying is that Gil Troy said that talk radio fulfilled a need for community. And this was long before social media and the internet. So how did talk radio fulfill that need for community at that time?
I think that this is something that is so often forgotten. That yes, talk radio arises as a place for conservatives to go who feel like their voice has not been heard in the media. But it also arises at a moment when, front stoop conversation is dying. People are going to the suburbs. They've been going to the suburbs. Suburban life starts to rise in the 50s. And those dense kind of neighborhoods that had been the staple of American life, where people could walk outside their stoop and have a community, are going away and have gone away. And it's a much more atomized world. And talk radio is a digital neighborhood bar. It is a place where people can have the kind of conversation they used to have over the back fence with their neighbors, and where they can really have a community. And especially local talk radio, people who are lonely, that host can keep them company. There was a conservative by the name of Ray Bream who was on overnight for about 20 years in L.A. And a woman who had listened to him faithfully for years passes away and deeded him her house. She willed him her house because he was her friend. And talk radio fills that role for people who are lonely. It's a very intimate medium in which people are having conversations, especially as the television rises and the console radio that had been the centerpiece of homes from the 20s to the 50s goes away. You have a situation where radio's niche in people's lives is intimate. It's something, there's a quote in the book from Neil Bortz, the now retired Atlanta host, who was a legend and did it for decades. He says, I'm talking to people in the car. I'm talking to people in the shower. And it's a real intimate kind of thing for them where they're listening and there's a companionship involved. And that is a need that we forget that, yes, it developed into the neighborhood bar in a conservative neighborhood, but that the prerequisite for that was that it became the conservative, that became the neighborhood bar.
You had mentioned conservative talk radio several times so far, that they were sort of the first as the innovators to capitalize on this changing environment. So I do have an obvious question for you. Why did conservative talk radio take the lead and not liberal talk radio?
Well, the answer is really Rush Limbaugh, to be very, very, very honest. He comes along, and Limbaugh, has no real political agenda on day one, August 1st, 1988, when he goes national. He had been a DJ. In fact, you mentioned being in Pittsburgh, and during that era, he'd been on smaller stations in Pittsburgh as a DJ in the 70s under the names Rusty Sharp and Jeff Christie. And he was spinning Elton John records, and he he used some of the same shtick. Things like talent unloaded from God and things like that. And, he was the kind of DJ who was calling the local pizza place and saying, can I have 1,000 pizzas? And then saying he was from the station down the road. Those kinds of hijinks. And he loved radio. He was a radio entertainer. It's become a little bit poignant this week when he talks about how it was going to radio school to learn what he needs to learn to get the license to operate a station. In that era was when he started smoking. He would quit in the early 80s, but with his lung cancer diagnosis, that's been, in the news this week. But Limbaugh loves radio, and he's an entertainer, and he wants to do a good show, and he's just having fun on the air. And a lot of programmers and executives misconstrue his success. They hear people calling up and saying, Rush, thank God you're on the air. We finally have a voice. And, dittos and mega dittos become the shorthand for Rush. We agree with you. We're so happy you're here. And then you get in the early 90s, you get first KVI in Seattle, and then KSFO in San Francisco that become the first explicitly branded conservative talk stations. And they take off in the ratings, and people are listening for unheard of lengths of time. And this sort of becomes the gospel in the radio business that the key to success is conservatism. That's what people are listening for. One day over Limbaugh's cigars, the general manager at KVI and the program director are smoking cigars with somebody from Limbaugh's syndicator. And he says, why do you guys have these liberal shows on? Nobody wants to listen to that. And they start experimenting, and they put on, they fire a liberal after getting some comments from their audience and seeing how things are going. They fire a liberal, hire a conservative, and watch the ratings go up. And that's when they go to this all-conservative format, and they think it's going to be profitable. And then the first attempts at liberal hosts, instead going to someone like Limbaugh, who had been on the radio since he was a teenager or earlier, who loves the medium and understands the medium, they go to Mario Cuomo and Gary Hart and politicians. And the politicians don't understand that they need to be entertaining, that this is a show, that this is not a place for sermonizing. And they're not that good. And when they flop at the same time that all conservative stations are taking off, it really just becomes understood that conservatism is the key to success. The thing you hear from a lot of radio executives is they talk about this idea of format purity. They say, you never play country music on the classical station, or you never put rap on the rock station. People want predictability. They want to know when they flip their favorite station on exactly what they're going to hear. And they say, well, the same thing applies for talk. If you're a talk listener and you are, you like Rush Limbaugh, you don't want to tune Rush Limbaugh in at 2:45 because you get in your car and have 7-8 minutes of Rush, the news, and then come back and have some flaming leftist on. I think that's a very oversimplified understanding. I think that you can succeed with these blended full-purpose full-service talk stations. They succeeded in a lot of markets, but that's sort of the first reason. And then when they get around to trying all liberal stations in the 2000s, there are a lot of built-in obstacles at that point. You have a lot of things that they'd have to overcome. They're on small signal stations, not those 50,000 watt flamethrower stations. They're the kinds of small stations high on the dial that if you cross the wrong street, you lose the signal. And you have, these corporate owners that are putting these stations on are not devoting a lot of money to promoting the third or fourth station they own in a market, because that's just not very good business. And you also have a situation where early in his rise, Rush has a lot of liberal listeners. Some of his affiliates do market research and find out that like a full quarter of his listeners are liberals, people who are either listening because he's making them laugh in spite of themselves, or they're listening because they want to scream at the radio. And with time, that fades. As you go to all conservative stations, you see the audience, that liberal audience say, well, I don't want to listen to this. It's getting more and more political and syndicated and less fun because these hosts have to kind of appeal to a national audience, and they fade away. So by the time you try these all liberal stations to bring these people back to AM radio, you wouldn't need a lot of promotion. But overriding this are three really important factors. One is that the liberal hosts they try, again, are not really radio people. It's people like Al Franken and Janine Garofalo who are funny people. They're good entertainers, but they're put in these pairs and they're put with radio veterans in these duos and trios on the Air America radio network that flops kind of spectacularly. And no, they really don't get that the goal of radio is that it's an entertainment medium. One of his producers asks Al Franken one day, says, Al, when you were on Saturday Night Live, did you get up every morning to rip the president? He said, no, I wanted to put the best show on. He said, well, why aren't you doing the same thing now? And he said, this is different. They had a mission. Having a political mission on the air just doesn't sound very good. So that's the first piece. The second piece is liberal audiences have a lot more options to go to find a spoken word product that appeals to them. NPR is not the equivalent of Rush Limbaugh because it is journalists who are mostly trying to present both sides. It has a liberal cultural bias. Absolutely, liberal cultural values shape what a lot of mainstream journalists think are news and shape the questions they ask as they report the news. But they are still trying to bring both sides. They're still trying to do a good faith effort to present what's going on in the world. But that product appeals to liberals. And that takes away, some of the audience. And then you have very robust urban or African American talk formats and Latino talk formats. And they, again, are not the equivalent necessarily of conservative talk, but they are pulling away a potential audience for liberal talk. And the same thing with what we know in the radio business is known as guy talk, Howard Stern kind of thing, which is more sexual, it's less political, it's often on FM rock stations, and it pulls a lot of young listeners away. People who, again, might be interested in liberal political talk based on the political demographics of America. And what it comes down to is, again, this is a business. I can't stress it enough. And there's not the audience for liberal political talk in the same way there is in conservative talk. And I think one reason why you've seen liberal political podcasts take off in the last couple of years, things like Pod Save America, is that the business side of podcasting is different. You don't need the same audience for a syndicated radio show, or you don't need the same audience for a podcast that you do for the syndicated radio show. And you can have a successful podcast without worrying about, I'll tell you a story. Alan Combs, I interviewed him before he passed away, and he told me, I got fired at times that I was number one in my time slot in a market. And they fired me because I was on at night, and I was generating a totally different audience than the conservative morning show on the station was generating. And they couldn't use my show to drive people to that morning show because it was a different audience. And in radio, AM drive is where most of the money is made. That's the big, important day part. So if your nighttime host was getting great ratings, but you couldn't use him to help promote your AM drive show, he wasn't necessarily useful to the station. And all of those kinds of considerations fade away when you have a podcast. And the other most provocative explanation for this, and I know that this is a long answer. It's a complicated subject. In fact, it doesn't lend itself to good talk radio because good talk radio isn't full of a lot of nuance and detail. But there's starting to be political psychology research. There's a new book by a scholar named Dana Young, and it's called Irony and Outrage, that posits that what's funny and entertaining to liberals and conservatives are very different things. And it's fit with something that I heard from radio executives and hosts left and right while I was doing years of interviews for this book, which was they'd say, liberal thinking doesn't lend itself to radio as well. That the best talk radio is black and white. It's a soap opera. And liberals are more interested in shades of gray. They want to say, Mario Cuomo, they try him on the air and he'll say, he'll make a great point, a really good, kind of talk radio segment. And they'll turn around and say, but on the other hand, and that just doesn't make for great radio. And it was something I heard over and over again. And I wrote about it in my doctoral dissertation. And then it did really get into the book because of what the publisher was interested in, and they wanted the political narrative extended more toward through the 2016 campaign and reasons like that. And I bought it on some level, and I tried to root it in theory about humor and things like that. But I wasn't totally convinced until I started seeing some of this political psychology research that indicates it may actually be true that what lends itself to the best radio is not necessarily what liberals find entertaining. And if you buy this kind of explanation, it's partly why liberals have dominated political satire and the Jon Stewarts of the world, late night television, whereas conservatives have dominated talk radio. And another theory along those lines is that whoever gets to something first and colonizes it, sort of people know that's where to go. And that's another explanation for it, and that one I think I buy absolutely 100% because if you think about it, I think Jon Stewart would have done a great talk radio show. I think somebody like Bill Clinton would have done an amazing talk radio show, even though he is a politician, because Bill Clinton loves to chat with people. He's somebody who feels your pain. He's somebody who can go from talking about, Arkansas basketball back in the day when he was president to economic agendas and things like that. And those people just didn't want to do radio. So it's a very long answer. It's a very complicated topic. And it's one that happens over several decades that leads us to where we are today. But I think to really understand why talk radio today is all conservative almost uniformly, and liberal radio has mostly failed, is that big, complicated picture of historical developments over multiple decades.
Well, one of the last points you made there, I thought really kind of sums it up from that standpoint, is that first to market concept, and also the point you made that earlier that liberals can find what they want in more places. And we're going back now to 1988. Liberals can find more of what they want in more places than conservatives do. They find this sort of, I guess, safe haven for themselves when they find talk radio. And now let's look at some numbers here, and I'm going to ask you about another element of this, another layer of it. But by 1993, Rush Limbaugh has 16 million listeners. And in 2017, the show reported that it attracts 14 million listeners a day. So that's sizable. That shows you how big it's gotten. Over the course of the years, talk radio and Rush Limbaugh has been credited with forming the philosophy or the concept behind what would become Fox News, and Roger Ailes, the relationship he had with Rush Limbaugh and the things that the two of them learned became Fox News and all of conservative media. And that's, in this past week, we're seeing that a lot of people in conservative media credit Rush Limbaugh for his role in that way. Now, here's that other layer that I was going to mention. This week, David Uberti of Vice.com wrote, he was talking about conservative talk radio. He said, it influenced other conservative media, pushed the Republican Party to the hard right on issues like immigration, and it pressured GOP leaders not to compromise with Democrats. So now we're talking about something more than entertainment. Now we're talking about influence and power. How did talk radio influence conservative Republican Washington politics?
Oh man, that is a big question. What happens over time is the people listening to conservative talk radio are the very same people who show up in Republican primaries. Americans are kind of notorious for not voting in primaries. And you get like 14% who show up. And the people who show up are the same kinds of very politically devoted, interested people who are listening to conservative talk radio. And over time, you get this impact where hosts, what makes for good radio is simple. It's black and white. It's a soap opera. It's entertaining. It's not hosts saying, look, I know they are Republican congressmen who we elected promised you X, Y, and Z during the campaign, but look, he's got to vote for this bill because the government can't shut down. That would be really bad for, people who, need a passport or who want to go to a national park, or says, they have to raise the debt ceiling because it could be catastrophic for the economy because of these factors. Those kinds of explanations bore people. It's much easier to say, well, that those sellouts, if they would just fight for you, if they just fight hard enough for what they promised you, just like the liberals do, they might actually win. They might actually deliver. Or, letting people call in and vent and saying, I hear you. Our values are getting trampled and these guys aren't fighting for it. And all of this, what makes for good radio is not necessarily what's good for the Republican Party. And so you get this call for a further right party that is not even further right ideologically. Some of it is ideologically, but tactically. That's gonna fight. That's gonna stand up for you. That's gonna say, you know what, shut the government down. That isn't gonna surrender. That's a talk radio kind of word. This tactical push, and especially as conservative media expands, as Fox comes along, as later, you get podcasts and Breitbart and Red State and Town Hall and all of these digital sites and podcasts and other things, and the marketplace is more crowded for conservative eyeballs and ears, you get even more of a push to the right to say something to distinguish yourself. So a host, for business reasons, is going to go, that much more towards the extremes. And the end result of all of this is what the expectations of Republican voters and the frustrations kind of bubble over. And it helps to drive the Republican Party to the right because at the same time, America is geographically polarizing. And you have red states and blue states. You have red districts and blue districts. And the most important elections in those places become the primary elections, not the general elections. And they're worried about losing those elections. And you end up getting people who become part of what they derisively call on Capitol Hill the Hope Yes, Vote No caucus, which is people who say, I really hope this bill passes. This is good legislation, but I can't vote for it. I don't want to lose. And so you have that. And you also see a second kind of related factor, which is what makes for a good radio guest. It's not the committee chairman who can spend an hour and a half talking to you about the intricacies of tax policy, or who can explain why they had to cut the deal or why the compromise deal was a good deal. That's not great radio. The guy like Congressman Jim Jordan or Congressman Mark Meadows, who are big Trump allies today, or Senator Ted Cruz, people who are going to come in and talk about values and feel the frustrations of the audience, they make for better guests. And these are the kinds of people who are not really team players in the political sense, and who in the 1950s, 60s, 70s would have been marginalized in Congress because you had to be a team player. If you betrayed, so to speak, the leadership, if you were not a team player when they needed you for something, you were going to get banished to sort of congressional Siberia, so to speak, which was, if you were from a landlocked state, they'd throw you on the Merchant Marine Committee or something like that. These people who would have been gadflies, who would have been outsiders, who really had very little influence in an earlier era, become superstars. Because ripping the leadership, going on the radio and saying, it's the leadership that's betraying us and we're trying to push them in the right direction and all this, that makes them good guests. That makes them good for business, and it turns them into stars. And they realize this is how you can build your own political career up. And so you start to see an inversion of power and the Republican Party lurching to the right and towards sort of warfare tactics in politics. And the end result of all of this is the upshot is that you have a Republican Party that really can't govern, especially under divided government. But even we saw it in 2017 and 2018 when they have unified control of government that is not working, that they can barely get anything done because their demands from their base are for things that are just the demands in their base are just not things that have broad enough appeal to pass, and where they won't do the things that would be popular, that 60, 70, 75% of Americans want, because those are things that the people that don't want them are their base. And they're worried about losing that base because that base is what shows up in primaries. I guess that's probably the most simple way of sort of describing the last 2/3 of my book. But, it's again, these are complex changes that happen over, decades.
You used a term that I thought reflected some other things that I read this week in the coverage of Rush Limbaugh. You used the term warfare tactics, and in one of the articles I read about Rush Limbaugh prior to this interview, the person commenting said that Rush Limbaugh would draw fire, but one of the other things that it said was that he's not about politics, that he knows social issues. Conservative Americans care about their base. So how important were social issues, not just the governing issues, not just the economic issues, or even things like national security, but those social issues? How important are they to the content of conservative talk radio?
They're integrally important because at the root of what creates the demand for conservative talk radio is the sense that people feel like their values are being maligned and their values are being trampled, and that America is in bad shape, that this culture war sense. I don't think it's a coincidence that President Trump awards the Medal of Freedom to Rush Limbaugh in the same State of the Union address in which he's talking about school prayer and other such issues, because there is a sense that America is going to hell, for lack of a better way of putting it, starting with the Supreme Court decisions of the 60s, taking prayer out of schools, legalizing abortion in 1973, those kinds of developments, but also the women's movement, that traditional idea of a breadwinner father who goes off to work in the morning and supports a family who has a stay-at-home mom and 2 kids, and that it's obviously a heterosexual couple. The rise of the women's movement and the LGBTQ rights movement, as well as sort of the rise of rock and roll and violence and sex on television and things. There is a sense that the world is kind of falling apart, that values that conservative Americans thought were bedrock and fundamental and unchangeable, and that they thought were really the key to American greatness, are under siege as far as they can tell. And they want to feel like they have a voice. They want to feel like someone is going to fight for them, someone is going to articulate those values, and maybe most importantly, they feel like those values are being put down by what they call the liberal establishment. And it's not just liberal politicians. It is the mainstream media. It is Hollywood and music and entertainment, for lack of a better catch-all term for these things. And it is universities and academics and things. And there is a sense that our values are being maligned. We're being put down, that this is so awful. And no one is sticking up for us. We don't hear the issues that are important to us in the media. We don't hear our values reflected in the news, the questions that are being asked, the stories that are being covered, any of this. And we want to have a voice. And so those cultural issues are really important in that sense. And every host is different. You have people like I mentioned Neil Bortz before, who was a libertarian, who he thought all this stuff, he wanted less government, low taxes, but he did not care about gay marriage, and he was not anti-abortion. And so those people do exist. Every host is different. Every flavor of conservative radio is slightly different. But what you have in a lot of cases for, driving this is that sense that we want conservative values reflected.
Brian, I have one final question. If there is a singular lesson from your book and all the research that you conducted, what is it?
Wow. I guess it would be that the more we as Americans retreat into echo chambers, the more that we're only surrounded by people who agree with us. Our neighborhoods, if you go out and you talk to all your neighbors, everybody's voting for the same candidate. And we only listen to news that we agree with, whether that's, somebody gets up in the morning and puts on Fox and Friends and leaves the house and turns on the local conservative talk station and might catch a little Rush at lunch and drives home with Hannity and comes home and watches Fox at night and is only reading Breitbart, or it's a liberal who's only consuming liberal sources. That as we live on different planets, it's fueling polarization and it's fueling the demonization of the other side, of instead of seeing good Americans, good people who just have different ideas about what's good for the country and the world. On the other side, we see people trying to destroy us and destroy our values and destroy the world. And that's a really dangerous, kind of toxic way of thinking about things. So what I would say is that the lesson of this is not we need to get rid of conservative media, not that we need to get rid of liberal media. The horse is out of the barn. You're not going to ever put the genie back in the bottle here. But what we need to do is people need to get out of their bubbles. They need to hear the other side. They need to engage with people who they don't disagree with, or who they disagree with. And, I guess that this is as much a lesson from the research aspect of this as it was from even the story in the book, which is I talked to a lot of people. I interviewed a lot of people with whom I didn't agree on a single issue. And I realized, these people are really nice people. They're well-meaning. I'm enjoying this conversation. And it's not something that necessarily, I knew it on an intellectual level, but I hadn't experienced it in quite that way. And it fits with those lessons of the book itself, which is that engage people, have friendships across party lines, across ideological lines, because otherwise there's no way for us to find common ground and solve our problems and address the issues that are so crucial to addressing in America. And realistically, for better or worse, both sides sort of have a political attitude of, well, let me sort of shove what we want down the throats of the other guy. Get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, do this with just Republican votes, those kinds of things, or do it with only Democratic votes. And, we don't have to worry about the other guy or the other side or any of that kind of thing. Unfortunately, for better or worse, we're, a 50-50 country or a 51-49 country or a 52-48 country. We're not a 75-25 country where that might have worked. And it's all something where if we don't find a way to come together, if we don't find a way to at least agree on the underlying fact where we can say, we might not agree on this, but is there common ground here? Then we're not going to be able to address anything because the country is so divided. And so that's kind of my plea to people. And I know that there are many who think that's naive or who think, how could that be possible given what the other side stands for? And look, I get that some days. If anybody looked at my Twitter feed during the State of the Union address, it was not complimentary of what the president was saying. And it found what the president was saying bitterly divisive. But it's important to try to do this because without it, we're becoming more and more divided, and it's dangerous. And we don't want to be two Americas. We need to be one America because we're stronger as one America.
Brian Rosenwald, thank you for joining us today.
Tim, it was my pleasure. It was great conversation.
To learn more about Brian Rosenwald and his book, Talk Radio's America, and everything we talked about today, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please help others find it. Leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you could get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.